I'm Kate from the Makery and I'm going to show you today how to make espadrilles. Quite literally my favourite thing to make at the moment. So what you need to make them is some espadrille soles, some fabric, so some nice fabric for the actual espadrilles and some lining fabric. I like to choose something with quite a small pattern repeat for the actual fabric. This is probably about as big as I would go. And then for the lining, it's really nice to use linen because then if your feet get hot, it still feels nice and cool on your feet. You also need some paper scissors and fabric scissors, a pencil, a tape measure, a needle, some pins, and the pattern that comes in your espadrilles case. You also need some thread as well, and it's quite good to have top stitch thread that's nice and thick so that it will hold your soles together nicely. And you also need a sewing machine, of course, as well. So, first thing you need to do is cut out your pattern. So you'll find the pattern in the box, and it's important to note that the seam allowance isn't included in the pattern. So what you need to do is find your right size and then draw a line which is 1 centimetre larger than your pattern size all the way around the outside of your pattern, and then cut to that line. So I'll just measure a centimetre, and then if you draw all the way around, and then we'll cut that out. Right then, so now you've cut out your patterns, adding the extra 1 centimetre all the way around for the seam allowance. So what we need to do now is place the pattern pieces onto the fabric and cut those out. So we'll do the lining first. So I'll take one of the pattern pieces, and you can have the fabric doubled over for the lining because it's the same. It will be nice and plain and you won't see it. So we'll pin the pattern piece on to the fabric. Oops. Like that. And it's really important to make sure that this line down the middle of the pattern here follows the grain line of the fabric, so the direction of the threads on the fabric. And then once you've done that, you just need to cut out around your pattern piece. Right, so we've now cut out the lining fabric around the pattern for the heel piece and the front piece. And again, we've lined up that grain line with the grain of the fabric. So the next thing to do is to do exactly the same, but using the actual fabric rather than the lining fabric. It's slightly different this time because you might want to think about the pattern placement of the fabric, which obviously you don't need to do for the lining. So if you have a think about it with this fabric here, what I would like to do is make sure that some of these birds are nice and prominent right in the middle of this pattern. So if I pop it on, do it over here, and maybe we'll have these two kind of flying around the outside, so I'll pop it on like that there. There we go, and pin it in place, and then do exactly the same as what we did for the lining fabric and cut around the pattern piece, and we'll do the same with this piece as well, okay? Right then, so now you should have 8 pieces of fabric, so 2 for the fabric front piece and 2 for the lining front piece, and then 2 for the fabric heel piece and 2 for the lining heel piece as well. So there's one more thing that we need to do before we start sewing, and that is you'll notice on the front piece of the pattern there's one side is the inside and one side is the outside. So what you need to do is make a little mark on the outside on the lining fabric. So we'll take the lining, match it up, and what I use is just one of these erasable fabric pens and just put a little cross on the lining fabric that corresponds with the side which is the outside. So if you just do that first. So next thing you need to do is pair up all your fabric pieces. So we'll take one of these fabric pieces here and put it right sides together with the lining piece, like that, and then pin it together all the way around. There we go. And we'll do the same for the corresponding heel piece. So take the heel fabric piece and the heel lining piece, place them on top of each other like that, and then again pin all the way around the outside, okay? So if you do that for the other two pieces as well, so that all of your fabric pieces are pinned together in pairs, and then the next thing you need to do is get out your sewing machine. Right, so now you should have your paired up and pinned up pieces of fabric. Oh, and we've got your sewing machine ready for the next bit as well. What we're going to do is stitch around the outside edge of each of these pieces of fabric, but we need to leave a gap on each one so that we can turn them all the right side out. So on the front pieces of fabric, you need to leave about more or less a 6 centimetre gap on the outside curved edge. So we know which side is the outside edge because it's got that nice mark on it. So what I do is I pop the pins in a different way so that I know when I'm stitching around I can just leave a gap there. So we'll do that to both of the outside of the front parts of the fabric. And then to the heel parts, we need to leave a gap about a third of a way along the bottom longer curved edge. So about there, again, about a 6 centimetre gap. So again, I've popped the pins in a different way just to show me that when I'm sewing. So what you need to do now is get your sewing machine in place. And what we're going to do is stitch all the way around with a 1 centimetre seam allowance, leaving a gap on each piece of fabric in those positions that we've pinned in place, okay? I've got the sewing machine set to just a normal straight stitch, about a 3, set to number 3 for the length. So make sure you do a little bit of reversing at the beginning and the end of each of your lines of stitching. Okay, so that's one of the heel pieces stitched all the way around the outside with a 1 centimetre seam allowance, and we've kept a gap here where we put the pins differently. So we need to repeat that process for the other heel piece and then for the 2 front pieces as well. So now we've got all of our pieces of fabric which have been stitched around the outside, leaving that gap of about 6 centimetres. So the next thing we need to do before we turn them the right way out is to clip the corners and curves. So every time we've got a corner, we'll cut off the excess fabric, not too close to the stitching, I'd say maybe 2 to 3 millimetres away from the stitching. And that just takes away the extra bulk of the fabric so that when it's turned the right way out, we've got a much neater finish. And I tend to do a couple of little kind of V's out of the fabric on any slightly curved edge as well, just to ease it a little bit and make sure it sits nice and neatly. So we'll do that for the front toe pieces. We need to cut little V's out from that whole of the way along that curved edge there, and then cut the corners off as well. So I'll show you now. There we go. 1, 2. And then we'll cut little V's out. Again, just being careful that you don't go too close to your stitching. All the way along like that. And once you've done that, on all your pieces, you can turn them the right side out, and then what you'll want to do is press them, iron them flat, so you should end up with a nice neat piece of fabric looking like this. Right then, so we've now got each of our pieces of fabric turned the right side out and pressed beautifully. Now some patterns might ask you to stitch up that gap, but I never really bother because I think, well, if you've pressed it nice and flat, actually the next line of hand stitching that we'll do will hold it closed anyway, and you won't have an ugly, well, you won't be able to see your stitching on the outside. So I never do that. So the next thing is to stitch the pieces of fabric to the soles. So if you pair up your pieces of fabric, so you've got one, you need per espadrille, you need 1 back piece and 1 front piece. And then if you remember before, we marked the outside edge on the lining. So that is the edge that goes down the outside of the foot. So if you imagine this cross is going down this side here. So they're going to be added like this. So what we need to do is, if you fold this heel piece in half first to find the centre point at the back, and then we'll line that up with the centre back point on the espadrille sole, like this, and then just pin that in place. And what we need to do is pin all the way round, And the pins, you don't want the pins to go in all the way so that they're piercing the sole. They just need to go through this jute bit in the sole here. So about every kind of 1.5 to 2 centimetres, we'll pop a pin in. And the pins go quite horizontally actually, just to try and hold them in place. So the purpose of the pins here is just to hold the fabric in place whilst we're stitching it on. So pin all the way around. And then the next thing you need to do is exactly the same, but for the toe piece, the front piece of the fabric. There we go. So that's pinned on. So we'll get the front piece and again fold it in half and then just put a little pin in to mark the front. So that's going to hit line up with the very front of the toe. So we'll pin that bit in place. And then exactly the same technique. Just pin all the way around to hold the fabric in place on the sole. Now at each side there's going to be a little bit of a crossover. So you'll have quite a few layers of fabric where the front meets the back. But that's okay. So they're starting to take shape and they look amazing. Oh my goodness, I love this fabric. There we go. Oh look, they're going to look so great. So get your needle and thread. So what you need to do is I've used top stitch thread, so it's quite thick, quite robust. And you need to double it up as well. And you need quite a long bit of thread. So I've got about 2 meters folded over to make a 1 meter length. Because you get through your thread quite quickly, so you don't really want to be knotting it and starting new bits too frequently. So it can be a bit fiddly, but it's worthwhile using a nice long piece of thread. So what we're going to do is start stitching so we'll start stitching about here on the inside of the foot, and we'll go in the direction of the heel. You were using blanket stitch. It's quite fiddly at first, but once you get into the rhythm, you get into it. And there's a technique which makes it a little bit easier, I think. So we'll take out a couple of pins where we're going to start. And what you do first of all, to hide the knot in the end of the thread, if you put you'll see on the inside, you can kind of prise open that jute sole. So we'll pop the needle in between 2 of those layers of the jute. I'll do it here. And then have it so that the needle comes out on the side of the sole where we want to start our stitching. And by doing that, it means that the knot can be hidden away so nobody can see it, okay? So we've got our thread coming out there. So what we need to do is I keep my thumb here on the left-hand side, and by having it there, it means that I can always hold this thread in place, nice and taut with my thumb so it doesn't get in the way. So about 1/2 centimetre along from where the thread first came out, we'll go into the sole again and then come up, out through the fabric, about 1/2 centimetre in from the edge, through the loop that we've made that we're holding open with our thumb there, and then pull it nice and tight, like that. And I always pull the thread towards the inside, like this, because it keeps the stitches nice and even. And then again, hold that loop of thread with your thumb and go in another kind of 1/2 centimetre along, up through the fabric, and pull it nice and tight again. Oops. When the thread's really long like this, it sometimes gets a bit looped up, so at the beginning it takes a little bit of fiddling around, but once you get going, it doesn't happen. There we go, so just take the pins out as you go and keep stitching, repeating that process and holding the loop with your thumb as you go. Whoops. we go. So what we need to do is continue this all the way around until we meet where we started our stitching. The reason we've started here is because if there's any slippage in the fabric at all, it means that we won't have a pucker in the fabric. We can just even it out at this join here. So I'll leave you to get on with that. Okay, so now you'll find that as you're stitching round your shoe, you've probably got to about halfway and you've run out of thread. So you need to try and change threads but keep it nice and neat on your shoe. So the best way to do that is to snip your thread but keeping and take the needle off, but keeping the tails of thread nice and long. And then thread your needle with a nice new piece of thread. Again, it needs to be about the same length as the last one, so a couple of meters folded in half. There we go, and we'll tie a nice big knot in the end again. There we go. Now, just like before, we're going to hide the knot on the inside of the espadrille in amongst those gaps in the webbing. So I'll, in this little gap here, prise the webbing open, pop the needle through there, and you want the needle to come out on the side, kind of where the next stitch would go, on the edge of the espadrille sole. So we'll pull it through. There we go. Conceal the knot in the sole there. And then what you've got is your new thread here and your old thread there. So what we want to do is tie those two in a nice tight knot. 1, 2. And then you can just carry on as you were, stitching around the espadrille sole. And that knot, it kind of makes it look like it's just a continuation of the stitching. And then once you finish, these two ends of thread here, you can just thread them onto your needle, put them back into the sole and then out the side and just snip them off to hide the ends of the thread. But otherwise, you can keep going. So keep on stitching until you get all the way back round to where you started from. Okay, so now we've stitched all the way around the outside of the espadrille, so that's nice and secure. So the final thing to do is to fit the shoe and sew up the two sides. So to do that, you need to pop the shoe on and then pull the sides as tight as you can when the shoe is on your foot, and then either just make a mark or, if you can, pin the side to the front where it meets on both sides. And you do need to make sure that you pull it nice and tight when you do that, because the fabric will kind of loosen a little bit over time, and you want to make sure that the backs don't slip off your heel. So as long as they're nice and tight, then that shouldn't happen at all. So once you've done that, this one's pinned in place, and you get your needle and thread again. And again, I do it with a double thread just to make sure that it's nice and strong. And one tip is to make sure that the knot of the thread isn't right on the inside of the fabric, because then it would rub against your foot and it can be a bit uncomfortable. So if you do your first stitch in between the two layers of fabric, like that, just to hide your knot on the inside, like so. And then I just do a running stitch to hold them in place, because I think it looks quite nice and it's plenty strong enough. So just do a few stitches up the side to keep both layers stitched together, like that. And then when you get to the top, literally only needs like 2 or 3 stitches. When you get to the top, do a few extra stitches just to really make sure that it's nice and secure, because when you put the shoe on and off, that's the area that will take a bit of strain. So I usually do kind of maybe 3 extra stitches at the very top just to make sure it's nice and secure. There we go. So again, it's quite a good idea to make sure that the knot that you tie at the very end is hidden away in between the layers of fabric, so that it's not on the inside and doesn't rub against your foot, because it can be a little bit uncomfortable. So if you just put the thread through to in between those layers of fabric. I'll do a little knot in between there. Oopsie. There we go. That's it. And then you can just snip the end of the thread off. Oh, obviously you need to do that on both sides. I've already done this side, so we're done. Isn't that beautiful? Lovely homemade espadrille, which, because they've got rubber soles, they're really, really hard wearing, so you can wear them you know, all the time. They'll certainly last a couple of summers. If you wanted to make them even more hard wearing, you could interface your fabric just to make it a little bit more robust. But otherwise, that's it. So just do the other one and then you're good to go. Have fun.